So good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Gasecki, and I am the Community Outreach and Education Coordinator with NAMI Greater Cleveland. We're very happy to be joined by Deondra Benson tonight. She is a licensed professional counselor and is a psychoeducation presenter with NAMI Greater Cleveland. She provides education on special topics pertaining to mental health for NAMI on an ongoing basis. And tonight we're in for a very important topic about the systemic effects of the pandemic on child and adolescent mental health and how we can better support the needs of youth. Please make sure you're muted. Please use the chat feature since we're a smaller group tonight. Definitely feel free to pose questions during the presentation. I will be monitoring the chat throughout, and we should be able to answer any questions that may be pertaining to a slide that Deondra is currently presenting on in the moment, but we'll also take some time for Q&A at the end. But before we do that, I just want to tell you a little bit more about NAMI Greater Cleveland so you're aware of us as an organization, the resources that we provide, the services that we offer. NAMI stands for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. It was founded in 1979 in Wisconsin by a group of mothers of children with mental illness. And they formed NAMI as a grassroots coalition around their kitchen tables because they wanted to support a movement for more education and support for families affected by mental illness. NAMI is now represented by state or local affiliates in all 50 states and is the largest grassroots mental health organization of its kind. NAMI Greater Cleveland is a local affiliate. We serve Cuyahoga County, and our mission is dedicated to improving quality of life for individuals affected by mental illness and their families through providing education, support, information and referral, and advocacy. We offer support groups for people with mental illness, support groups for family members. We offer 8-week educational courses for people with mental illness and also for families. We're involved extensively in education in the greater community, serving law enforcement, healthcare professionals, schools, universities, corporate groups, nonprofit organizations. And we also have a helpline that's available Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. That can assist callers inquiring for more information about accessing mental health treatment, substance use treatment, and other relevant community resources that may be part of one's journey toward recovery. And also NAMI is involved in advocacy. NAMI is very involved at the national level in research, involved at the state level and the national level in legislative advocacy to make mental health a public health priority. We all are probably aware that we're seeing a secondary pandemic related to mental health in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we want to make sure that mental health is a priority in that ongoing process. And also we want to reduce the stigma around mental illness and make mental health something it's okay to talk about in public, in community spaces, and thereby reduce some of the stigma associated with having a mental health condition. So that's NAMI Greater Cleveland. We're going to move now into our presentation, and I will allow Deondra to introduce herself and get us started. Thank you for being here tonight. You're muted, Deondra. There you go.
Hello, everyone. I am Deondra Benson. As Matt said, I am a licensed professional clinical counselor and PsyD candidate. God willing, will be defending my dissertation in about a month. So a little bit about me and my professional work. Currently, I work for the Positive Education Program in the Connections Division as a intensive home-based treatment supervisor, where we're really focusing on the needs of youth who have severe mental health and behavioral health challenges, such that it puts them at risk of out-of-home placement. So connection, togetherness, supporting natural supports and communities is kind of the name of the game, and also so very important when we are talking about supporting the needs of youth during these times. So just kind of moving forward, children are not necessarily the face of this pandemic, but they risk being among its biggest victims and biggest largest group of individuals who have some severe needs as a result. So it is so very important for us to pay attention to those needs and respond as we possibly can. So just getting started, if you'll go ahead in the chat, put your name, and also tell me one thing that makes you happy. And the reason for that is, we're talking about things that are kind of gloomy. And so it's really important to provide balance to everything that's going on and, just build awareness of where we are. Reading. Oh my goodness, yes. During COVID, a group of friends and I decided to do a book club. Anybody else? Hi, Katie. Oh, music. Awesome. Outdoors, yes. We found ways to, build supports and come together, even though we have been coping with the COVID constraints here. Cooking. So all of those things are so important. Marla said food, family, friends, family time, being able to control peace and boundaries, so very important. And yes, family and friends. You definitely learn to value those things in such a challenging time. Just a few reminders, virtual manners, platforms like this is something we've become accustomed to over the course of the past year, 2.5 years or so. So just want to remind keeping your microphone on mute when you're not speaking. But because this is a smaller group, I do invite you to speak up, share, put your questions in the chat. I will do my best to try to address those questions either in a moment as we're talking in our discussion today or during the Q&A at the end. So thank you. So let's talk about the impact that COVID has had. I'm probably preaching to the choir when I'm talking about some of these things because we have all experienced them. We've experienced health challenges, economic challenges. We've seen housing insecurity, changes with education and the way that it is provided. We see political discord, and all of this increases the risk for trauma exposure and developmental trauma. In addition to all of these things, we've seen a rise in mental health emergencies while simultaneously experiencing a decrease in when I say the system's capacity as a whole to address those needs. And so, we have had to be very creative in our approach here. One thing that I encourage you all to think about and everyone to think about when we're talking about COVID is it's not just a pandemic. COVID is a syndemic situation in that we have multiple threats that come together to impact individuals. There's a complex relationship between the burdens, between if you already are struggling to find employment, find housing, and then have health challenges on top of that, and then you get COVID, and that experience is a much bigger challenge. I've heard it said, we are all floating down the same river, currently in a storm. Some of us have a yacht, some of us have a sailboat, some of us have a canoe, and others have maybe water rings or flotation device. Let's talk about child and family considerations. When we're thinking about the impact that COVID has had on children, we've seen many of the spheres that children interact in be impacted. We've seen the COVID slide, we've seen interrupted learning, disruptions in nutrition programs, changes in supervision, ability of parents to provide supervision in childcare. We've seen digital dropouts, increased opportunities for stress and exploitation, social isolation, declines in social emotional learning, and also this leads to challenges in measuring and validating learning. We're seeing some social promotion, and at that point, how are we really ensuring that we are providing quality educational service, mental health services, the whole 9 yards. So we've had to be creative, and I've found myself in a position of looking like this and interacting with the kids who I work with. So it is all encompassing. We have to be aware of that. I don't know if you guys have seen some of the TikToks on COVID babies, and these babies are different. They're having different experiences. And while some of that is tongue in cheek, there's also a reality to it. If you are developing in a different environment with less interaction with others, your course of development is going to be different. In 2.5 years is a huge chunk of development in a 5-year-old kindergartner's lifetime. We've seen changes in support. We've seen increases in stress level. And, while children are very malleable, they're not independently able to overcome that adversity. So children learn to adapt to their environments, grow up psychologically healthy if they're provided with those necessary resources to modify the functioning that course of development that might come with interruptions and trauma. So, we have seen talk about a developmental dip, cognitive performance in children being different, but, we're not really sure if this is a matter of selection bias, if this is a matter of changes actually in performance. But we do know that children are resilient. We do know that with the right supports, they do overcome. And more recent data has shown that children do overcome some of these challenges when given the right supports. We know that many children have experienced caregiver loss in the face of the present times. These numbers are updated as of February 2022. It's estimated that 1 in 360 children lost a parent or other in-home caregiver to COVID-19. And we know when that happens, dealing with the loss of a loved one due to COVID-19, there are increased risks for mental health challenges. And those children might need special attention, counseling, support to address those needs. Let's look at also brain development. We're human, we all have a brain, and the brain is organized in three relative parts. We have the prefrontal cortex, which is, if we were to put our hands right there on the top of our forehead, we'd be touching it. That is the part of the brain that helps us to make decisions. It's the part that helps us think before we act. And when the brain is in control, that is kind of that part that says, okay, I'm calm, I'm safe, I'm going to make smart choices for myself. Underneath that, we do have the hippocampus and the limbic system, which is largely responsible for memory and encoding those memories. That is very much so impacted. It helps us save old and new memories, and it can help us kind of decide what to do based on those previous experiences. And finally, we have the amygdala, which has been likened to the system's guard dog. It's the part of the brain that helps us to feel emotions. It helps to keep us safe and guards against the things that could hurt us. It tells us, okay, we need to have a response to that fight, flight, or freeze when we sense danger. So this is something that I like to share with many of the kids I work with, oftentimes their parents, kind of an understanding the way the brain is organized and the way that we might respond to challenging stimuli. So if you think about putting your hand up beside you and our fingertips being our cortex and our limbic regions being the thumb, if we were to put our thumb across our palm, and finally the brain stem and the base of the skull. So our brains are designed to keep us safe and away from danger. It's biologically necessary. You know, the caveman saw a lion coming, he needed to move. And so when in danger, the amygdala sends those messages to our nervous system, adrenaline kicks in, and we have that fight, flight, or freeze response, and it takes over. So let's say with our model, the cerebral cortex is covering the limbic system, cerebral cortex is engaged. Sometimes when we're upset, when we are triggered, we might flip our lid. And so we might lose contact there. And so our cerebral cortex is not driving the vehicle per se, but we have emotion and response, adrenaline. So the reality is that our brains were organized at a very early time. And currently, very few of us have lions to be running away from. So our responses to relatively minor stimuli can be the bigger responses that one would have when they are in physical danger. Most of the time, those are not the experiences that we're having. This can also explain the decision-making and adolescent development. Think about some of your most outlandish adolescent experiences. And you think about the development of the prefrontal cortex, the front part of that cortex, which doesn't happen until the early 20s or so. And so while there's a lot of power in all of this, it's also about learning to modulate those two systems and use self-regulation skills. I've heard it said that when we're at our angriest, when that prefrontal cortex, cerebral cortex is not engaged, we're at our stupidest. We flip our lids. So talking about brain development within all of that, within that context, emotional regulation is something that is learned over time. It's a skill, and we've experienced collective traumas. We can work to create environments that support youth development, that support that regulation and that skill building, and also that sense of safety. Stress, anxiety, that includes depression, feelings of hopelessness, are normative reactions to everything that's been going on. However, if we don't find ways to deal with it, to cope with stress, it can be harmful to our daily functioning. We can have challenges in our relationships, increased stress, challenges with our activities of daily living, and can lead to overall deteriorating mental health and also physical health if we're not careful. Let's talk about pandemic fatigue. We've been in a position of, dealing with this pandemic for quite a while now. And the cumulative effect of those stressors have taken its toll on us, and sometimes makes this the straw that broke the camel's back, or the last mile for us. And so fatigue and burnout are very real. There are no easy answers for that, but it's helpful to kind of revisit some of the ideas that have helped us to move through this pandemic and stay safe. I think the reality is that COVID-19 has become something that we are going to have to find ways to live with. So even so, in the midst of those times, we have to find opportunities for self-care. We have to be intentional about our behavioral approaches so that we can kind of control and create resilience. At the same time, we have to give ourselves permission that even as things may improve, we may still deal with grief, we might deal with exhaustion, sadness, and allow ourselves the time and opportunity to allow that impact to process through. So if we think about, development, challenges in development at different stages in children, we might see things like a decline in skills and developmental milestones, changes in behavior, GI issues, anxiety, aggression. All of those things can lead to can be signs of additional challenges and a need for intervention. That differs as children develop. In older children and adolescents, we might see changes in mood that aren't typical. We might see changes in behavior, loss of interest, sleep disturbance, changes in memory, academic effort, interest, appearance, reckless behavior, or even morbid thinking. So thoughts about one's own mortality or suicidal ideation. And a big word about suicide risk. We know that rates of suicide for both adolescents and adults increase during times of high stress. We've seen it during this pandemic. And in addition to screening for depression, anxiety, changes in behavior, we also want to screen for suicide risk and ask direct questions. Are you having thoughts of suicide? And making sure we respond appropriately. We have to remember that not everyone who thinks about suicide will talk about it, and not everyone who talks about suicide will act on those words. So it's so important to ask. And if any talk about suicide should be taken seriously. If you're worried about your child, if there is any mention, make sure you safety-proof the home, remove weapons, ammunition, household supplies, medications, put them in a locked cabinet, and also seek help immediately. This can be done by calling the suicide hotline, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or going to an emergency room. We also, as adults, have responses and reactions to stress and experiences. So adults might experience changes in energy, sleep problems, changes in diet and appetite, interpersonal challenges with family and friends, social withdrawal, isolation, confusion, irritability, changes in concentration, focus, thinking, and efficiency. All of these are signs that, okay, we as adults need to say, hey, I need to take a step back and take care of myself. Maybe seek some mental health care. So let's talk about ways that we can help children cope with mental health challenges, cope with stress. We can help children with healthy routines before bed, like bedtime or morning routines. Talk about things that they are happy or thankful for, not as a direct antidote to the things that are going on, but it's important to provide some sort of balance. And also practice focused breathing, practice that feeling of safety. And also it's an important thing for self-regulation when children are able to understand that, okay, I'm coping, I have control over my breathing and my responses. When we think about young children's coping and responses, we really have to think about things from a developmental perspective. Everything is to scale. We have to look at, is the behavior appropriate for the situation, appropriate developmentally? And finally, what purpose is it serving in the environment? How is it helping the child to achieve the objectives and milestones that they need to be achieving?
Can you give an example of perhaps like a developmentally inappropriate behavior, just for context on, what kind of behavior might be in that category, might be a sign of something else that needs to be addressed?
Okay, so in, let's say a child is toilet trained and they start bedwetting, that would be a sign of challenges. Let's say a preschooler is exhibiting more aggression. Let's say that they are biting or getting into fights. That might be a sign that, okay, it might be time for some intervention. Children don't have the words to say, okay, I'm feeling misunderstood, I'm feeling hopeless and helpless. Oftentimes behavior is the only tool that they have. And so we have to intervene there. And we also have to change our perspective of things. So when we're thinking about behavior, how are we framing this? Is this just the child being bad, or is this about survival? Is this distress, or is this a child who's continued to persevere and show resiliency? And so we're able to respond in a positive manner to all of that. Talking about stigma is so important here. When we have stigma, when we stigmatize mental health responses, normative responses to challenges, we see that people have a delay in mental health treatment seeking. We see people get to a point to where they don't seek care until, oh my gosh, it is so overwhelming and I'm in the emergency room, or I find other outlets which aren't necessarily as helpful as they could be. And people tend to present for treatment with more severe symptoms. We know that stigma impacts the self-esteem, impacts resilience, relationships, goals, and the way that someone sees themselves. It also severely impacts health outcomes. And so we really do need to pay attention to these things and view this as something that everybody has. Everybody has a brain, everybody has mental health. Talking about difficult things, children talking about difficult things. We have to start the conversation by asking children about what they know. We have to provide basic information in an age-appropriate manner without a lot of detail. And generally, we want to let the children's questions or concerns guide what you are saying. There's not one specific conversation that happens. This can happen, in little bits over time. We really want to normalize talking, not, okay, now's the time for the big conversation, and we never address it again, because we make that a much bigger deal than, or more overwhelming than It has to be. We can't be in denial as adults. We don't pretend like, oh, everything is totally fine. Children pick up on our concerns and our approach to things. It's important that we provide reassurance. We don't tell children they shouldn't be worried. We want to help them learn to deal with it. So don't say, don't worry, don't freak out, but show them how they deal with things. We also have to remember what is developmentally appropriate again. Egocentrism in children is very much so developmental. And so children oftentimes need to focus on their own needs before they are able to see a bigger picture or think about anyone else. We have to say stress is a normal part of life, and also help children identify steps that they can personally take to protect themselves, to help themselves feel better. And they can feel better when they do have some sort of control over the matter. One thing about COVID is there is a lot of information. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And so we have to be very careful to address misinformation. Maybe they were told the wrong information, limited information, they weren't told enough, or misinterpretations and misconceptions. Children are great recorders, but terrible interpreters. So sometimes it can be helpful to have children explain what they heard, repeat it back. Trying to reassure them by telling them it could be worse is likely to expand fears, or what if it will get worse? So we really want to pay attention to those things. Remember that children are particularly sensitive to routine, changes in routine, and we do need to communicate those things. That is especially true for children who have disabilities. Predictability and routine is severely important. Our goal should be to restore that. Think about the brain dysregulation, flipping the lid. We want everything intact. So just a few discussion starters that can be used with children. Starting to have, okay, so COVID can be a challenge. What worries you? Have you been feeling nervous? Sometimes people do feel nervous. Wearing masks and staying at a distance from others is not something we normally do. How do you feel about that? We really want to open up the doors of communication, see where children are with things, and build on that from there. Has anyone had any conversations with children about this? Any other discussion starters that you would add? Okay, so some of these discussion starters came from the CDC. There are a whole host of them, and they, that changes with the time. We think about media. As I said, we're in endemic conditions, and so there's a lot else going on. And so we do have to balance that level of awareness and our sense of safety, sense of self, and remind ourselves that we are okay. Media consumption. Oh, wait, Sharonda said something. Asking students when they came back to school what they did to stay busy and positive. so important that we are focusing on the positive, but also getting input and responses for how are we coping. With media, we have to make sure that we have a healthy media diet, that we are not consuming too much media, that we are avoiding doom scrolling, but still staying informed. Making sure that we are getting information from the right media sources. There are several articles about political discord and even witnessing police brutality, George Floyd, those sorts of situations, and the impact that it has, the secondary trauma that's experienced, especially among Black youth. So it's important to limit that amount of media exposure. We want to build awareness, but we don't want it to be overwhelming or overcoming. We want to provide reassurance and help children to identify the feelings that they are having in the moment. One way to think about the impact of COVID is through the diathesis stress model, or our level of an exposure to risk. Longer term impact will vary a lot, and that's based on each child and family's individual experience of the pandemic. For those who suffered major losses like bereavement, loss of housing, a family member with significant COVID-related complications, job loss, food instability, there might be a longer term impact. That doesn't necessarily mean that experiences will have diagnosable mental health conditions. These are normative reactions to abnormal circumstances, but we do have to be aware of that. So the diathesis stress model essentially states that each of us have a different propensity to developing different challenges. I might have a family history of depression, and if my experience of COVID has been one that is rougher or more challenging than others, then those types of experiences might lead to my developing a condition. So basically, if we think about those two cups, the cup 1 and cup 2, cup 1, we have a lower propensity, the D1, and then cup 2, we have a higher propensity, D2. We have the same amount of stress added on to the cup, but it will take different amounts of stress to overflow the cup for each person. So if we think about, this was the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. This was their way of conceptualizing resilience in the context of COVID. So resilience helps us get through or overcome hardship, but it's not necessarily something we're born with. We all have positive factors and negative factors, and we have that middle piece there where we have that balancing beam. So I'll take you guys back to possibly middle school science, where you may have talked about simple machines and a fulcrum on a lever that changes the amount of effort that's required. So on this case, we have negative outcomes that appear to be outweighing some of those positive outcomes. We can lighten the load on the negative side of the negative outcome side. That could be in assisting with job security, that could be in decreasing the exposure to COVID, and alternatively, we can provide support or increase the amount of positive outcomes there. So that can be in the way of making sure we have appropriate services, appropriate benefits, housing. Or, they say that we can move the fulcrum. So if moving the fulcrum in the physics example changes the amount of effort and work that is needed. And they liken that fulcrum to internal coping strategies that one might have. And so if we are building those core skills, all of us need executive functioning, self-regulation skills to manage daily life. We're able to change the balance there. I like this model because it doesn't always only focus on building grit and the ability to withstand challenges and those who are most vulnerable, but it also looks at the context and support. So it's a both and situation. Let's look at building blocks of resilience. Oh my goodness. I have support. I have people around me. I have strength, confidence, esteem, and responsibility. I can use and develop the skills and support. So it's a feeling of self-efficacy and also possessing the skills and having the external supports. We know that protective factors support resilience. So protective factors are those pieces, events, conditions, characteristics that increase the likelihood of a positive outcome. And then resilience is our adaptation. We know of risk factors, we know of protective factors that come into play there. And those risk factors can be on, and protective factors can be on several levels. We know that we have internal factors, so our coping strategies, our skills, our self-regulation, our sense of control. We have external factors, which have to do with family and other people around us, our supports. And finally, we have community and systematic factors. So those are resources, those are friends, those are our networks. So let's talk about defining resilience. We have a pattern of positive adaptation in the context of past or present adversity. So what are we able to do to strive even though all of that is going on? It's not a trait that we develop in isolation. It's a trait that we develop with the process, and it's oftentimes described as kind of a messy one. It's learning from mistakes. It's learning to cope and adapt. It's learning from others. And so, we all need those supports to overcome adversity. One important way to think about support and resiliency growing from adversity is to have this growth mindset. We can approach a fixed mindset. This is how it's going to be. It can be marked by a very external locus of control, or we can have a growth mindset impacted by our thinking about things in a way of we can try again, understanding failure, growth as an effort as the target, not necessarily staying in a fixed state. So looking at some of the examples here on the page, I'm wondering if I could tell you give you a statement that is more of a fixed mindset statement, and you all make it more of a growth mindset statement. So if I were to say to a child, oh, you tried as hard as you could, how could I make that more of a growth mindset statement? Okay, next time you'll do an even better. You haven't got it quite yet, but you're close. Yet is such an important word. Practice makes perfect. Keep trying. We're really focusing on the fact that there is more potential for growth. So we might want to say something like, the goal is to improve your understanding step by step. You learn from this. What can you try next? What can you practice next? What's the next step? Let's keep moving. We want to try to keep things moving. What if I said something like, oh, maybe algebra isn't your strong suit? Well, there's a space for honesty and awareness of growth and strengths and weaknesses. We might also want to say something about the learning process. When you learn how to do a new type of problem, it develops your brain. So focusing on building that muscle, building that strength, stressing the process of work.
Hey, everybody! This is your old pal Grover speaking. Oh, today we're going to have so much fun because this here is the letter R, and today we're going to talk about the letter R.
So let's talk about the 3 R's, kind of in summation here. Reassurance, we want to make sure we're providing children with reassurance, a sense of safety, a sense of support, focusing on routines and making sure that there's predictability built into the process, and regulation. We want to build those emotional regulation skills because that is the supportive piece that builds and supports resiliency. I think Taramika said something about a child asked me to protect, how is practice made perfect if nothing is perfect? Exactly. There's not perfect, but it is that process and valuing that process that we really want to develop. Practice makes progress works. Exactly. I love that one. We want to talk about responsive relationships in remote environments, more R's. There's a lot of alliteration today. So science tells us that responsive relationships, those are serve and return interactions between children and adults, which are important. So if a child said, I made a car, even the response, the awareness, acknowledging that you heard them, you made a car, is part of that responsive relationship. That's that interaction that happens. And those principles apply both remote and in person, but in a remote setting, we have to work even more. It's even more challenging to develop that. We had to find ways to express empathy from a distance. So children learned, okay, this is what it is to give and receive empathy. We might have to exaggerate the tone of our voice, express it with our eyes, and use nonverbal cues such as head nodding, reflecting, awareness, providing time. You know, one of the things I noticed early on, when COVID hit, I was working in a school doing psychological tests. And I noticed that as I was giving a test behind the mask, behind the shield, maybe children weren't understanding what I was saying and weren't pulling things together, because there's so much that goes into understanding language and speech. If you can't see someone's mouth, half of someone's face is going to be hard. So if I say the dog jumped over the fence and jumped into the pond, splash, that child is not going to be interacting with me. That child is probably going to be more disengaged because you're already on a screen. You're already, there's already that barrier to communication. If I am exaggerating what's going on, the dog jumped over the fence and into the pond and splash. That got your attention a little bit more. And that helps children stay in connection with another person. So that is super helpful. Let's talk about coping with COVID. We want to talk with, things that we have done to modify the way that we are working with one another in COVID. Talking with family and friends, making sure you continue relationships, even if it's a virtual setting. We want to, you can have children make encouraging signs and posters. And, this is part of their active coping, active engagement with someone else. If talking live is not an option, writing emails, writing letters. When I was a kid, I was super fascinated by getting mail, and we don't get much mail these days, so that's a big deal. And then finally, going outside and saying hello to people, but keeping a distance. My next door neighbors on a regular basis sit out in front of their house, and that has been their way of maintaining some sort of contact with each other. And, this isn't just about the kids. This is you too. So co-regulation is a big part. It's hard to support children when you are dysregulated. It's also part of that co-regulation. Children pick up on your stress. If you are stressed, if you are hurried, if you're unfocused, those things are going to show through. They see that. But we want to relay consistent messages, and they need to know, hey, you got this. And finally, talking about getting help. This is for anyone, finding a good therapist. We have to make sure we're facing our substance abuse issues. I think it can be easy to slip into, oh, I'll have a drink to try to cope with things. Learning self-regulation in response to anger, setting boundaries. I think someone mentioned that we have to get rid of toxicity. Making sure we have balance, making sure that we use relaxation, making sure that we're grounding ourselves, getting good nutrition, exercise, air, etc. We have to talk about our experiences and have an open exchange. And finally, finding out about where we can seek help. The Cuyahoga County Mobile Crisis Team is a great resource in this area. They are part of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and you can speak with a mental health professional 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. NAMI Greater Cleveland runs a line as well, where you can call in and talk to someone maybe there's a hot moment or something going on and you just need to decompress. They're also great with providing resources and suggestions and supports for people. And then there's SAMHSA. They have a behavioral health treatment services locator. Employer resources are often a tool that people use, calling the number on the back of your insurance card for your insurance plan. They will route you to someone in network. There's Psychology Today, so find a therapist search. There are so many places where we can go and we can seek support, and I encourage you all to do so, should that be something that's needed. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Deondra. And I actually wanted to ask at least one question. Definitely, if anyone else has some questions, feel free to put those in the chat. But I wanted to ask about considering how important school is as an environment in which skills are learned and socialization takes place for children, you know, throughout the developmental journey. You know, not only children in elementary school or middle school or high school, but also college students as well, you know, who are still being in late adolescence, many of them. Can you speak at all to how the disruptions to traditional school environments and the rapid transition to remote learning have kind of affected socialization, mental health development for children, adolescents, and young adults? And I'm thinking also about kids with ADHD who really struggle to adapt to that mode of learning. Just have some kind of, if you can shed any light on that particular topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's been very challenging working with youth, working with a population of youth who have mental health challenges. Something like ADHD, if we are having challenges with focus, you know, we don't have those opportunities for movement in the classroom. The teacher is not necessarily able to use proximity. If you're off on another task, the teacher might, you know, subtly walk up and put their hand on your desk. Okay, that is another form of redirection that can occur in the virtual setting. A lot of times children don't have the parental support, or parents don't really quite know those techniques to use. And so there's a lot of communication that is lost. Social milestones that happen. You know, I know that many adolescents didn't have, you know, school dances, not a prom, graduation. Those sorts of celebratory pieces weren't always there for people. And so, you know, we've really had to be creative in finding ways to cope with that, or to use celebration to celebrate in different ways.
Yeah, and I'm thinking also about childcare and many of the parents and families, working parents, that struggle to adapt to you know, work from home arrangements, or arranging, you know, transportation and childcare for their children in the midst of the pandemic. You know, it was really interesting to hear some of that, to see some of that data that you presented on, you know, youngest kids born, you know, COVID babies and not meeting certain milestones. Then there's a lot there as well. Also in that, you know, in the systemic and syndemic dimensions to what you're talking about here as well.
Yeah, you think about the type of exposure that a child has before school. Oftentimes it is limited to an immediate family, but also they benefit from extended family, from neighbors, from going to school, interaction with one another. And one thing that we're hearing from preschool is that children are getting a lot of experience or a lot of exposure to their parents, but also not necessarily interacting with one another. That peer interaction piece is something that they are really working overtime to provide.
Absolutely. So just as a note for everyone, I did put the link for the evaluation for today's presentation in the chat. I just dropped it in there again. It's a short 2-minute survey. It's anonymous. If you could all open up that link right now and complete it for us, that would be greatly appreciated. We do appreciate your honest feedback on our programs, and part of why our surveys are so important to us is that that data is part of what's reported to our funders, and the funds that we receive are a large part of what allows us to offer programming like this to you on a regular basis free of charge. So please do complete that evaluation before we end. I did just put the link in the chat again. Also, we will be sharing these slides with you at a later date. I'll probably send them out tomorrow if I can. We'll send out the link for the evaluation again. If there's no further questions, I think we can call it a day. Thank you so much, Deondra, for generously donating your time and expertise on this topic to educate the NAMI community. And thank you to all of you who were present for tonight's program. We greatly appreciate your involvement with NAMI. So with that being said, I hope everyone has a great evening and stays cool. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.